So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, David Dean, who tells me he's the CEO of Solar Africa Limited, a company that provides solar-powered lighting in Africa. It is a major provider of equipment that brings a huge improvement in the quality of life to the poorest people on the planet. David is particularly concerned about business growth in the developing countries. He grew up in a farming community in Somerset and worked for 20 years in veterinary pharmaceutical company. He sold a cell phone dealership and invested in a livestock farm. After retiring for a second time, he spent 6 months doing voluntary work in Africa for Solar Aid. He has a healthy interest in politics without being a member of any party. David, over to you.
I learned in my early days in sales and marketing with a multinational company that nothing happens until somebody sells something. Nothing happens until somebody buys something. That equation is the main pillars of any market. You can have the best factory, you can have the best fleet of lorries, you can have the most attractive marble offices in Mayfair or Canary Wharf, but if somebody doesn't sell something, and a product doesn't move off the shelf from the factory, then all that is a waste of time. The same applies if somebody doesn't buy from your stall at the market. You are the customer, the consumer, and you decide to buy something. You choose. Soon we will have to choose if we want to stay in the EU, the European Union. When we joined in 1973, we were led to believe we would be joining a common market for free trade. Later in 1975, Harold Wilson called a referendum to ask if we wanted to stay in. Then we chose to stay in, but a lot has happened since then. Let's look at the facts. You will be voting shortly by putting a single cross on a ballot paper to stay in or out of the European Union. You're voting for the future prosperity of your family and the standard of living and the sort of country you want your children and your children's children to grow up in. History tells us many things. Karl Marx had an idea that communism was the best thing for society. The panacea that equality for all is the fairest, and it was for the future. It was brutally applied and caused misery to those countries under its control, but it didn't work. Mainly because we're all different. In my lifetime, I was fortunate to see the collapse of this communist system, and symbolically, I witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. So today, we should not lose sight that the EU is an experiment, an idea, and in Brussels, it's seen as a dream. Now we are faced with deciding whether the experiment is working, and if this is a structure which we, the British people, feel represents the most prosperous, the safest, most secure environment for us, our children and our children's children. Are we being led down the garden path by a small group of elitist bureaucrats into a federal state controlled by an unelected minority which we cannot vote? We cannot vote out if we so wish. I pose the question, you must decide. We must avoid drifting into the status quo. We must all look at the facts and satisfy ourselves if there is a better alternative which we can democratically choose. We must each decide very, very carefully. So let me state my position. I'm not affiliated to any particular political party nor any political persuasion. Indeed, I'm sceptical of some politicians. I confess to having a healthy interest in current affairs, business affairs, international affairs, as well as a desire for social fairness and justice. I'm here today representing the average man in the street, trying to make an informed decision based upon as much accurate facts as I can gather. I have access to various think tanks and the Westminster Research Unit, so I'm satisfied I'm working with accurate information. when I decide for myself if we stay in or we vote to leave. In my early life, I worked for a large multinational pharmaceutical company and various other businesses thereafter, of my own small businesses. So I've had experience of large business and small business. I had a herd of Sussex cattle and I used to sell my meat directly to the general public. After retirement, not content to sit idle, I looked for a new challenge and spent 6 months in Africa volunteering. After my contract ended, seeing the vast opportunities, I set up Solar Africa to distribute beneficial solar lighting to the very poor. Some of those people live on less than $1 a day. I've enjoyed many challenges and experiences in large and small businesses, hence my invitation to speak today. I see colossal opportunity in the world, and I envy the young of today who have creativity, ambition and energy. Go out into the world and use your skills to better your standard of living and help your country. There is no excuse for idleness and laziness or complacency. I wish I had another 40 years in front of me. So today, you are the most important single unit in the EU. In this huge equation, you decide what you buy, and your vote decides Britain's future. So it is vital you understand what you are voting for. I can say with certainty that there is no one can say for sure what will happen if we come in, if we stay in or we come out. The in camp will say one statistic and the leave camp will say another. I've heard an informed source saying coming out may have a short-term impact of our GDP of about 0.5% until our growth in exports for the rest of the world starts to kick in. I've heard the stay-in camp say that we won't be allowed to trade with the EU. That sounds a scare tactic, and I can't see us being stopped from buying BMWs and Mercedes. So today we will deal with what we are sure of. We will deal with facts, things of which we can be sure. One thing we can say is that the European Union is only an experiment. It has never been done before. Everything and everyone is breaking new ground as the experiment evolves, and that has been going on for 43 years. Fact one, the two main pillars of the EU are the single currency and the free movement of people. Both the main pillars are not working, so many people will say immediately and ask the question, why are we still in? Fact two, Spain has 56% unemployment amongst the young, the consequences of which will cause social unrest and a harmful impact to families for generations. They should have been allowed to let their currency float. Facts emerging from Poland indicate family breakups is now a huge social problem. This is a direct result of the free movement of people, an example of the negative effects of social cohesion in the EU. Fact number four, economic growth in the EU is stagnating. Britain buys more from the EU than it sells to them. That must stop before we run into problems. Fact number five, because of the EU rules, Britain cannot trade directly with the rest of the world. We cannot negotiate our own bilateral trade deals with countries throughout the world. It must go through Brussels. Fact six, Britain has been trading nation for hundreds of years. In the 1800s, we were the first exporting nation. Our ships sailed the seven seas with our produce. There is no reason why we cannot resume that trade if we voted to leave those rules behind us and trade freely. After all, we have the Commonwealth, we have the English language, which is commonly used throughout the world for trade, aviation, communications, music, films, engineering, and British produce. British products are viewed as quality and sought after worldwide. Why do we need to be held back by 27 other partners, sometimes vying for the same business? Fact 7, India is a huge expanding nation, English speaking, and is projected to have a greater GDP than China. For 3 years, the EU has been undecided about trading with India. It has been suggested that one reason is that it might disrupt the Italian textile industry. That decision is not favourable to our commercial interests. Getting approval from 27 other member states is slow, cumbersome, and may not be in Britain's interest when the decision is eventually made. Far too slow for efficient business in the global business world of today. And the order might have gone to another nation anyway by the time they get round to it. Britain is now becoming a big player in satellite production and space technology. India too is expanding into this space industry. Britain's growth as a country is restricted and our prosperity reduced if we are unable to fully participate in the huge developing industry worldwide. Fact number 10, the accounts of the EU have not been properly signed off for at least 19 years. Fact 11, a BBC report dated February 2014 concluded bribery in the EU was widespread, unquote. The extent of corruption in Europe is breathtaking and cost of the EU economy at least 120 billion euros annually, says the European Commission. The EU Home Affairs Commissioner, Cecilia Maelstrom, has presented a full report on the problem, and she said the true cost of the corruption is probably higher than 120 billion. 3/4 of the Europeans surveyed for the Commission study said the corruption was widespread, and more than a half said the level had increased. In the study, UK respondents, 1% said they'd been expected to pay a bribe. It was the best result in Europe. And the report continued, Croatia, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania and Greece, between 6 and 29% of respondents said they'd been asked for a bribe. There was also high levels of bribery in Poland, 15%, Slovakia 14%, and Hungary 13%. Mrs. Maelstrom said corruption was eroding trust in democracy and draining resources from the legal economy. That's on countries questioned. Originally, the report was also supposed to have included a chapter assessing corruption within the EU institutions themselves, as well as in the member states interviewed. But that idea was dropped, and I find that particularly shocking. In conclusion, I can say I confine my words to substantive facts. Like many of you, I have still not decided finally which way to vote in or out. In order to fully satisfy myself with certainty, I will take myself back to 1975 when I was faced with the same decision, in or out. This time, I'm armed with 43 years of actual facts. So if I apply all those facts to the promises the EU gave in the last 43 years to what actually happened, I arrive at a more accurate decision. So if I knew then what I know now, I would never have voted to stay in. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all on a bus and the driver does not know where we're going. So if you do not want to go there, press the stop button and get off.
Thank you very much, David. Our next speaker is also called David. Councillor David Lewis is here on behalf of Vote Leave, a cross-party campaign group that also involves more than 1,000 business leaders. David is a Conservative councillor for Surrey Heath Borough Council. He is a lifelong Eurosceptic. He was too young to vote in the 1975 referendum, lucky chap, and has seen all his worst fears about Europe realised over the subsequent years. David served in the Royal Air Force as an engineer. Since leaving the RAF, he has worked in engineering management for the IT and automotive industries. During part of his political career, he has worked in Michael Gove's parliamentary office in Westminster. 4 years ago, David lost his son to a genetic heart condition known as sudden arrhythmia death syndrome. He has been busy lobbying members of Parliament in an effort to raise public awareness of this condition. And I hope I speak for everyone here If I said we wish you success in that campaign as well. David.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to sit down for one because I'm not an accomplished public speaker. Right. The 20th century was not kind to Britain. We fought a world war in the early part. We fought a second one 20 years later. 20 years after that, we suffered the biggest slump ever in our history. We were a sick country. Is it? Okay. Okay, how's that? Okay. Did you get the first part? Okay. I've read many theories as to why we ended up in such a shocking state. But my belief is those three items are connected. The military doctrine that officers should lead their men into battle meant that we lost twice in a row generations of men and some women who would have formed our businesses' civic leaders when they became middle-aged, who would have fallen in the 60s and 70s. This, I believe, was a major contributory factor to the decline we saw in those dark days. The generations that have come after, to slightly paraphrase the words of Kipling, have stooped and built up this country with worn-out tools. We are now here, stronger, confident, and more able. We have always been a great country. The ebbs and flows of history brought us to our lowest point in the 70s. The invitation to join the common market must have seemed like a lifeline. Do I blame my parents' generation for taking us into Europe? Not really. Had I been able to vote, I would have voted against it. My experience of life as a Caleb youth was entirely different to that of my parents, which was different again to that of my grandparents. I don't believe for a minute they would have envisaged what was to be inflicted upon us as a consequence of that vote. I can't judge them, as I cannot stand in their shoes. Today, however, I believe, as a country, we are on the ascent, and I can judge my country and its people from my experience. The truth is, I believe in us. I believe that we have the strength, the ability, and the drive to strike out on our own. While we are shackled to the yoke of the EU, we can never be free. We cannot forge our own destiny. We cannot become the country capable of being. Which brings me to the referendum. Before I go much further, I'd like to address Project Fear. I want to make this one point. Can anyone here recall any government of any country that set out to control the behaviour of its people through deliberately inducing fear? And when it was done, was it done with benefit? Please think about this. This is what we have done. This is how the pro-Europeans behave, and this is what we have to stop. We're not just voting to keep our sovereignty, we're voting on preserving our culture. We're voting to prevent becoming a culture that condones and accepts this sort of behaviour. As we get closer to the referendum, and I suspect we'll only then see the full effects of Project Fear. As Winston Churchill put it, fear is a reaction, courage is a decision. The In campaign will have to deploy Project Fear so the vote takes place when people are in the reactive stage. Fortunately, they have a lot less faith in and deep knowledge of British people. If they think they can manipulate us quite that easily, I know we remain much sterner stuff. In fact, I take great comfort in the second verse of our national anthem. Although it's an entreaty to God regarding our enemies, the lines confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks, strikes a chord that is hard to resist, because that is what we're up against, knavish tricks. I only have to refer to the example earlier this week regarding possible immigrant camps in Folkestone. There's going to be a lot more of this sort of nonsense in the weeks to come. And incidentally, unless you haven't heard, border controls at Calais are a separate treaty between us and France and will remain regardless of the outcome of the referendum. So, what are my major problems with the EU? They boil down to three things, and these are the three things that both me and the most concerned about too. Firstly, money. The EU is currently costing us £350 million completely. £50 million a day. Just over £2 billion an hour. The duration of this meeting tonight will have cost the country £5 billion. And that, to me, is fine. I'll try not to bore you with too many facts and figures. This is what Vote Leave is about. Facts. The wonderfully acronymed Britain Stronger in Europe, BSE, and I'm going to refrain from mad cow jokes, will wheel out experts who, as prognosticators of doom, will tell us how bleak the future will be if we leave the EU. And it will be a purely subjective analysis based on that expert's political leaning. In cases like this, I always fall back on the definition of expert that was given to me in the military. X is
spurt was driven under pressure. Vote Leave is all about purely objective facts regarding what Europe has done and what it explicitly says it will do. Are you wondering why that was sat there? This lightweight tone is a result of Vote Leave's research. Free printed copies are as rare as hen's teeth. It is a free download as a PDF on the Vote Leave website. I would strongly recommend doing so. There's a lot in it. I can't even begin to cover the executive summary of this speech. Isn't it? Okay. Right. Is that better? Okay. Sorry. I said I wasn't accomplished public speaker. Right. Back to the money bit. Since 1973, we have sent £500 billion to Europe. To put that in context, the Apollo program cost the US taxpayer just over $25 billion. Adjusted for inflation and converted to sterling today, that is 139 billion pounds. In the last 40 years, we could have funded 3 full-scale Apollo projects and still had £80 billion left in loose change. At least the Apollo missions moved man beyond the shackles of this planet. What does the EU achieve with our money? And what do we get for this huge investment? Nothing. We are a net contributor to Europe, having paid in more than we have taken out since 1975. And it's not only the direct cost to us. It is conservatively estimated the cost of EU legislation to our business is in the region of £600 billion every year. And on top of that, they demand an extra £1.7 billion from us in 2014, which the government paid as well promises to the people. My second concern is control. The EU is undemocratic. This is the one single point that upsets me most. It denies us a say in how we are ruled. We are the home of democracy. It started with the Magna Carta. Is it really going to end like this? This vote will be democracy's last stand. Because if we say yes to Europe, we're saying yes to an unelected leadership, and I cannot, and I will not vote to be a part of that. And what of our influence in the EU? Of the 72 laws we have voted against, guess how many times we've been outvoted? Every single one. The cost to us has been somewhere in the region of over 2.4 billion. 40 of those occasions have been since David Cameron became Prime Minister, giving him the somewhat dubious honour of having lost more votes than all the other Prime Ministers that preceded him combined. Actually, that may be a little unfair. Tony Blair's former EU advisor has admitted that in the end they started voting for items they disagreed with simply so they wouldn't be seen to be fake. And the future of our influence isn't that rosy either. The countries that have adopted the single currency now have a permanent voting majority in the Council of Ministers. And this means that we will, in the future, always be outvoted, also adopt EU laws regardless of how damaging they are to us. Legal sovereignty. EU judges who overrule laws our Parliament has made on subjects as diverse as counter-terrorism powers and beer duty. Our Parliament has done little more than talking shop, which should think. And Jeremy our Corbyn's manifesto. Most of the promises are incompatible with European law. We simply can't deliver on them. Believe me, I disagree with nearly every word that Mr. Corbyn says. It should be down to you, me, and the rest of the British people to tell them exactly what you think of his policies via the ballot box. That is how democracy works. And I am with Voltaire on this one, and I will defend via this referendum Mr. Corbyn's right to advocate policies he sincerely believes in, and not have them throttled by unelected EU judges. And finally, well, on this subject, the indicator of our influence in Europe concerns the election of Jean-Claude Juncker. Do you know how many people in the UK voted for parties that put him into power? 0.18%. Remember that figure. Our influence is huge. My third concern is safety. The erosion of our safety by being in the EU and the distortion of the facts by the EU campaign. Our intelligence and police agencies now have their powers dictated to them by the EU courts under the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. I don't think there's anything else I can add to that statement that could in any way emphasise more the threat to our fundamental rights and freedoms.
border control. I know this is the hot button issue with UKIP. I suspect the other speakers will expand on this subject. But I would just like to add my support to the statement by counter-terrorism experts that this is like hanging a sign raising terrorists to Europe. It's also interesting to note that borders are now springing up all over Europe as countries of the EU are finding out a little too late. Control of borders is critical. And to deal with two of the more duplicitous statements from the IN campaign, international policing. That is not a function of the EU. Interpol and other such agencies are separate from the EU, and whether we're in or out, these agencies will still operate as they always have done. And peace. NATO provides peace, and NATO is totally separate from the EU. The US is the biggest contributor to NATO, and as far as I'm aware, they have still yet to join the EU. Right, that's my concerns regarding the EU, but I do, however, have several other concerns regarding this referendum. Firstly, I have an issue with the Prime Minister. We have a leader who stood up in public forum and categorically stated that we would be better off being led by somebody else. And that bothers me hugely. As Alexander the Great once stated, I'm not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I'm afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. We, the British people, are an army of lions. And to be quite frank with you, we deserve better from our leader. And the piece in our time document that David Cameron has returned with. President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, declared any EU reform would not be irreversible. So any concession David Cameron claims is worthless without treaty change. And finally, visions of the future. Nick Herbert, chair of the Conservatives for Reform in Europe, has criticised the out campaigns for their failure to offer a clear vision of life after Brexit. 2 points here. I've yet to see a clear vision from the IN campaign of life in the UK and of the increasingly tightening noose of EU control. The second point is, did we enter 2 world wars with a clear vision of life afterwards? No. We stepped into the unknown simply because it was the right thing to do. And so, to address the future, whether we stay in or leave, we will not be leaving much for the generations that follow us, especially those that go into business and politics. The debt is not going to disappear overnight, and we will rightly be reviled for that inheritance. But the one thing we can do is give them freedom. The generations that follow us are not cleverer, stronger, and more resourceful than we are, and we have failed. And I believe they will have the strength, character, and the resolve to continue to make this country greater still. By voting to leave, we can loosen and release the shackles of EU dogma, and allow those that live in this green and pleasant land after us forge their own destiny, supported by freely elected governments. To allow them to go forth in the world as free agents so they may, in turn, create a brighter future for their children. Thank you. Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Caroline Stevens, who is here on behalf of Leave.EU. By the way, you may have seen all sorts of press comments about the various groups, all fighting each other. I'm very pleased to say that we managed to break that up and clean all the blood off the walls before this meeting. Anyway, Caroline Stevens was appointed as a spokesman for Leave.EU in August 2015. She previously worked in insurance and later retrained as a maths teacher and became known as the Wiltshire Financial Education Campaigner. She received recognition for her school charity work in encouraging children to prioritise their needs and avoid getting into debt in a parliamentary debate on financial education for young people in December 2011 when MPs debated the importance of financial education. She became interested in political matters after attending a public meeting in March 2013. She has worked for the Leave.EU group for the past 18 months as their campaign manager and has recently been promoted to the position of head of training. Very pleased to have her here this evening. Please welcome Caroline Stevens.
Thanks, Robert. We haven't been going 18 months, but so I don't know about your maths. You were saying you were an accountant, weren't you?
I'm discounting the tax.
Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. As Robert mentioned, I did join Leave.EU, which was the No, in August last year now, and we've now become part of Grassroots Out. So has anybody heard of Grassroots Out? Yes. Right, okay, because Nigel's been sharing a platform with people like Kate Hoey and Tom Pursglove, Peter Bone and Philip Hollowbone. So we're bringing all the politicians, or as many as we can, together and share the same platform, which is great. So yeah, we're all united in leaving the European Union. So I'm not here really to talk about so many of the good reasons why we should be leaving, because I'm looking for activists in this room tonight. Now, Terry, I know Terry. Terry invited me to speak tonight. Terry, what made you want to leave the European Union, or have you always left the European, always wanted to? What was the reason?
I've always been firmly in the opposite camp until about 4 years ago.
You wanted to stay until 4 years ago?
Until about 4 years ago,
Right.
I went to a meeting at which Nigel Farage was speaking, and I was firmly convinced from then on that he was on the right track.
What was the reason that? What was that
I
pivotal?
can't remember.
Robert, what was your reason?
I just thought it was a thoroughly bad organisation. I was concerned about the unnecessary expense and the sheer bureaucracy of it all. I want to live in a free country. Do you know the European Union doesn't even trust you to choose your own vacuum cleaner? You know, talk about freedom. I do trust you to buy your own vacuum cleaner.
Diane, can I ask you what was the pivotal reason that made you want to leave?
Being a member of the European Parliament since July 2014 has really put into context actually what it's like, and I endorse a lot of the comments already in terms of the lack of democracy and, quite frankly, the overwhelming control that comes down from the system.
So you can see, just by asking 3 people already for their reasons, people have different opinions, people have different perspectives. Now for me, my background was that I went into insurance when I left school, worked in financial services, dealt with the mis-selling of financial products. We all remember that? Some of you will be affected by that. I led a team of managers in London to deal with this mis-selling. And I saw firsthand just the misery that people were put under by being led by the wrong people. So I was then going into schools in 2011, giving advice to children on saving and not going into debt. And you know, it's such a powerful experience to change children's lives for the better. You know, children will say, Miss, that's fantastic, that's a brilliant lesson. I'm going to go home and put money away. You can't beat that. So here we are, fast forward now to me leading the training for Grassroots Out. So I can imagine having Nigel Farage in my class any day soon. So we're getting all the activists on the same page. The referendum is now upon us. So we've got reasons such as loss of sovereignty for people. That really upsets a lot of people because we cannot govern ourselves. No matter what the politicians in number 10 say, we do not govern ourselves. 64.7% to be precise on our website of our rules and regulations emanate from Brussels. We're influenced by them. So what else have we got? I mean, we want our MPs to govern us again, don't we? That's what we pay them for. Tony Benn once said, what did he say? He said something along the lines of, if you cannot get rid of the people who govern you, you do not live in a democratic society. And the people who govern us are not our MPs. So we do not live in a democracy. Now, TTIP. Has anybody heard of TTIP? The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
Could I have your attention, please? This is a staff announcement. Would Jake please come to main reception, please?
We're going to have to edit this out of the video, David. Right, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, to save anybody's blushes who've not heard of it, is this agreement that's going on behind closed doors behind Obama and Merkel with the EU Parliament. and it's a trade deal. So we keep hearing, don't we, from the BBC about how good the EU is for trade. Well, let's look at it from a different perspective. Look at these trade deals like TTIP, where, why is it being agreed in secret? Because we're looking at a globalist agenda here. We're looking at these big corporations being able to dictate what we have to live under, effectively. We're going to have the NHS privatised, greater privatisation than we have at the minute, with American corporations being able to buy into our NHS. Isn't that the jewel in the crown? Isn't that so sacred for the British people? We want to preserve our NHS. We don't want to sell it to the Americans. And then we've got these corporate courts. So we've got these global corporations who want to buy in, and if our government says, well, hang on, we want to stop your profits, you know, let's calm these profits down, they can go to these corporate courts and sue the national governments for the loss of profits. And that's all part of TTIP. Now, it hasn't been ratified as yet, but it's only going to be a matter of time. But in the meantime, we've got something called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. People aren't talking about that. Similar to TTIP. This time it's between Canada and the EU. So you've got, effectively, American corporations who've got Canadian subsidiaries, or in fact, an American corporation can simply up sticks, move into Canada, and do the same thing. And if you think about it, if anybody's ever been to America, you know that the food standards are not the same as the European Union standards. In parts of America, 60% of chicken has cyanide in it. So you've got the prospect of growth hormones, food additives, GMOs, all being added to our food, and we can't do anything about it. So you will need the NHS after all that, won't you? See what I mean? And, you know, employees' rights. You hear on the television so many times, don't you? Oh, it's good for employees' rights, you know, solidarity in numbers. We British workers can get together with workers from the continent and we will present a stronger force. Well, I mix with a lot of people from the Trade Unions Against the EU organisation. They're unionists, but they do not believe in this at all. They can quote case law after case law in recent times where employees and employers have been to court over their employees' rights. And which side do you think wins all the time? You guessed it, it's the employer that wins. So can you see this a picture emerging that the EU is very convenient for a globalist corporation mouthpiece? So I'm hoping in this room tonight that we're going to have some grassroots activists here with unity of purpose. You might all have different reasons for wanting to leave the European Union, but you're determined to make sacrifices to help this cause. This is a cause that's once in a lifetime. I wasn't old enough to vote in 1975. I'd like to think that I could have seen through the lies, the propaganda at the time, because they always intended, the government always intended for it to be the United States of Europe, although they never said so. So we want to put those rights, those wrongs, back to being right again for our children and our children's children. We know this matter is really urgent, so we need to be contacting grassroots or Vote Leave or UKIP, the people who are going to get us out and get organised. Because I'm working with all these groups and also Better Off Out, who's not here tonight, but the posters are up on the wall. Bruges Group, photographer tonight from Bruges Group. There's lots of out groups. We're all working together for one common cause. How often does that happen? We've got this mission and we need to get out. So we've got unity of purpose in this room tonight, I hope. We know this matter is urgent, and we need unity of action, so we need to be planning. Terry, you're in charge in this area, aren't you, Terry? So we know that unity of action. So we're looking at organising street stalls. I'm really passionate about street stalls. Do you have them in this area, Terry? Great. Group of people on a Saturday morning, during the week, depends on the working conditions, working commitments. Going out there, sharing this word with the people in the street. You need to look professional. You want to look approachable. You're going to put any party rosettes to one side because we're all working together. This isn't about party politics. Now, Robert mentioned I'm head of training. So I'm going to be training activists to work on the questions and answers that people are going to be asking. So everybody's going to be giving the same answers. We're going to be looking at the reasons for leaving, like I just mentioned about TTIP and CETA, and making yourself updated knowledge-wise. We need to be professional. So, really, we've got unity of purpose. We know this is urgent. We're going to have unity of action between us all, and all we need is you. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Our final speaker before we come to questions is Diane James. Diane James is one of UKIP's 4 MEPs for South East England. She is a member of the European Parliament's Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. Diane had previously been a member of Waverley Borough Council for 9 years until 2015. She came to prominence in the Eastleigh by-election, where she got 27.8% of the vote, coming a close second and just missing out on becoming the first person to be elected as a UKIP MP. She's UKIP spokesman on justice and home affairs. She has appeared on Question Time, This Week, The Andrew Marr Show, and many other radio and television appearances, and tonight we're delighted that she's appearing here with us. Please welcome Diane James.
Good evening, everybody. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I can tell you that this audience, just like all of the events, you're a lot more daunting than the likes of David Dimbleby and Andrew Marr, because I've got a good chance, if I'm watching the teletape that's in front of both of those individuals, as to what's coming down the line. But when I finish and we open up with questions, I've actually got no idea what you're going to pose to me. I'm going to ask, though, first of all, those who voted in the European elections in July 2014, would you mind putting your hands up for me, please? That's not a bad showing, not a bad showing. Well, regardless of what you voted for in terms of political colour, I was one of the 10 MEPs sent across to Brussels to represent the United Kingdom for the South East region. And quite frankly, of all the 10 that are over there, we reflect, I think pretty clearly, the political colour of the South East. There is a sole Liberal Democrat, there's a cohort of Conservatives, there's obviously ourselves, the UKIP branch, and there is also a Green. And there is actually a couple of Labour people as well, so that's not too bad going. It's really a very, very democratic scenario. But what then is very, very distressing is that in terms of what clout we actually have over in Brussels and Strasbourg is very, very minimal indeed. Currently, if all of the United Kingdom MEPs were to disregard completely their political allegiance, their political colour, use that lovely phrase that's been bandied about recently and put country before career, we can't even muster 10% of the parliamentary support in the chamber. That's both in Brussels and in Strasbourg. And David, at the end here, in terms of his political colour, if I was able to persuade just the group that his party sits with, which is the European Conservatives Reform Group, I still can't even muster 16% of the chamber. Now I think that's a very, very clear message already, that despite what our Prime Minister would like to portray, the United Kingdom, quite frankly, in terms of the clout, the position, the influence, now and also going forward, is not huge. I'm sure all of you out there are engaged, maybe not on a daily basis, but maybe only in social occasions or in work occasions. You're starting to talk about issues around the European Union membership. And I do hope you keep making the point. It's membership of the European Union. It's not membership of Europe. We're not talking about filling in the channel with a load of sand. We're not talking about suddenly building a huge amount of land bridge and connecting us to Europe as a continent. We're talking about an affiliation, a political affiliation, one that controls, as has been said, controls, directs, interferes with, and pushes, if you like, the future for the United Kingdom into a European context. What I would like you to do, once you leave this evening and after you've had the questions, and you are talking to people and interacting with people, I would like you, every single time, to ask yourself this question. Could the United Kingdom achieve whatever the aim, whatever the issue is that you're discussing, unilaterally, on its own, as a sovereign nation, without being politically controlled by the European Union? And I think you would find really quite a series of shocks. We don't need the common agricultural policy to dictate what our farmers do, how much food we produce. We certainly don't need the common agricultural policy to tell us that we have to set aside land and subsidise our farmers to do that. We don't need the European Union to tell us that we need to be part of the energy union, that we must go down the line of renewables and then duplicate energy supply by importing vast amounts of gas. This country is quite capable of making its own decisions about where its power source comes from. And equally, our government, we entrust it with the decision, and quite rightly, how much investment it feels it should put in, over what time frame, and at what pace in terms of renewables. The United Kingdom is not energy sceptic, it's not anti-renewables, and yet that's exactly how the European Union would like to paint us in terms of our energy policy. Now equally, there's aspects in terms of the climate change directive. Everyone knows, I hope, about the impact that's had on some of our major manufacturing industry here in the United Kingdom. And if you read your papers today, we really are still going backwards in terms of our manufacturing capability and the contribution it makes to the United Kingdom finances. Now my view is, I don't want the European Union, via some misguided policy, dictating how we manufacture, what we manufacture, at what cost, and who we engage with in terms of customers. And yet that's precisely the sort of issues that the European Union feels it should take in Brussels, in Strasbourg, and in the issues in terms of law in Luxembourg. Now many people actually say to me, Diane, what do you actually do as an MEP? Convince us that you actually do something and it's worthwhile and it's for this country. 3 weeks, roughly, out of every 4 in a month, I spend 2 or 3 days in Brussels. And I'm there to sit in on committees and contribute. And I'm a full member, as has been explained, about the Econ Committee. And I'm substitute on Leave, which is effectively justice, home affairs, these sort of aspects. And then also on Envy, which is public health. And given my background as the medical world and pharmaceutical world, I'm interested in public health aspects. And lots of people say, well, you've got to be at those committees. You've got to contribute. You've then got to be in the parliamentary chamber and contribute in terms of the debate. Well, let me tell you what the standard of debate is actually really like. You book to give a 1-minute or a 1.5 minute, or if you're really, really lucky, you get 2 minutes. And you're literally giving a prescribed line. And I hope after what I've just said, some of you might take the trouble to go online, do some research, and look at some of the comments, look at some of the quality contributions. Because what you will see is a very, very clear divide. There are people like me who go into the Parliament who vote in the United Kingdom's interests. I'm not interested in whether we give a licence for another soya bean, genetically modified version, as we did 2 weeks ago. I'm not interested in that. That is not important to me. What was important 2 weeks ago in Strasbourg was the fact that they'd like to water down an investigation into the diesel emissions scandal. Because, of course, the biggest contributor is automotive. And who has got the biggest automotive industry in Europe? Happens to be Germany. Does Germany want that investigating and exposing? No, it doesn't. So the issues for me every single time, whether I'm voting, whether I'm debating, whether I'm speaking, is I am standing up for the United Kingdom. But what is distressing ultimately, everybody, is you, people like yourselves, in all good faith, put an X against a particular party in July 2014. And last year, you then put an X against another party and a person. And on both occasions, you thought you were actually getting something for the value of that vote. And the distressing perspective for you all is that the first vote that you gave entrusted an organisation with more power over what happens to the United Kingdom than the vote you gave in May 2015. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, and we do cite this, it was something one of the political leaders pulled out. He made a very, very interesting statement. And the statement went along these lines. I'm going to paraphrase slightly. But it was, what puzzles me is that Western European leaders seem so focused on recreating a Soviet Union-style Europe. That is exactly what we are in, what we're about, and what the future is. But you, ladies and gentlemen, every single one of you, you're not going to be asked to vote on the status quo, and you should not vote on the status quo. You should be looking 5 years down the line, as I'm doing. 5 years down the line, there would be 5 more countries in the European Union. That will further dilute what an MEP can do, what an emissary, a commissioner from a particular country might be allocated in terms of portfolio and the influence they might have. Ultimately, it will mean that if David Cameron, assuming he doesn't win, or he does win, sorry, but he's still forced into another referendum, instead of trying to coerce and convince 27 member states to go in line with his thoughts, he's going to have to convince 32. Now, I know within the audience this evening we have got a cohort of people who feel absolutely as passionately as I do about leaving that we ought to remain. I'm going to leave you with a series of messages. If it wasn't leave or remain, it was actually in or out, do you still feel as fervently that you could give the tick or the cross on actually going in? And I go back to that question I posed to you at the beginning. Remember, you're talking about giving political control of this country's future, this country's business, this country's finance, this country's defence policy, this country's legal system. You're talking about every facet, every aspect of your life. You're giving that away to somebody else. If equally, if you're still of the view that we ought to remain, then really take on board what you are bequeathing for generations to come. Because as some of my colleagues have said this evening, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'll be 6 foot under or a bundle of ashes by the time we get another opportunity. And I don't think it's fair that we don't take what's before us very, very seriously, consider the issues, come to meetings like this, do exactly what Caroline suggested, however you feel about it, but think about what the key issue is. And it is political control. That's what we're giving away, and that's what we're giving away in every single facet of our life. 3 weeks ago, and I'll start my ending bit here. 3 weeks ago, one of my colleagues challenged Mr. Verhofstadt to come to the United Kingdom and do the sort of debates that we have in the European Union. And Mr. Verhofstadt is a former Prime Minister of Belgium. Belgium is a founding member of the European Union concept, and he is so Europhile, it's untrue. And he's very theatrical in the chamber, almost sort of Shakespearean sometimes with his hands and his voice and such. But if you look at some of the speeches he's given, and I do recommend you look at those, he outlines to the absolute detail what staying in the European Union will mean. And I reiterate, every single thing that you hold dear, be it our legal system, be it our police force, be it our military, be it control of our airspace, be it how much VAT we are charged on goods in the shops, be it how much corporate tax companies pay, how much control there is in terms of directives on wildlife and land and such like, and designated areas of that outstanding attribution. If we vote to stay in, we give away the right to actually control that from London, from the House of Commons, from the Scottish Assembly, the Welsh Assembly, and from Stormont. And I don't think that's what we do. Thank you much, everyone.
Thank you, Diane. We now come to questions. These have been submitted on slips of paper, and I tried to put them into groups. I do not know the background of the people who asked the questions. We start with a question from Rowan Munson. I don't know, is he here? Well done, nice to see someone young here. He asks, someone younger. Before we do that, by the way, I have to tell you the results of the raffle. The winning tickets are, none of them are mine, I can tell you that straight up. First prize, white 545. Second is green 200. Yellow 347. Yellow 329. White 579. Do I keep going? Okay. Well, the 6 white 590, green 233. They'll be put on the items at the end, and you're welcome to draw them. The first question is from Rowan Munson. How will leaving or remaining within the UK benefit Surrey's young people? And I have a similar question from someone who's just called Ian, called how will the campaign engage the younger voters? So I don't know who would like to try to answer that question. There's Caroline, could we ask you?
The younger voters. There was a report that went into Parliament in the beginning of 2014, and it was about small businesses, and there were various bits and bobs about how the EU was an impediment to business. And one of the items was about apprenticeships. So the fact that we have got this report and the EU does cause us problems on apprenticeships, if we're no longer part of the European Union, then we'll be free to impose our own legislation and rules and regulations on apprenticeships, and it's got to be better than what is happening at the moment. That's my bit.
Anyone else want to comment?
I'm going to pick up, if you don't mind, on two areas. I'm sure most people will be familiar with the first one. The problems with the Eurozone has really created a significant increase in unemployment in the Mediterranean countries. And we're talking in the region of 25% in one country, right up to nearly 50% in somewhere like Greece. Now, what do young people do if they can't get a job? Understandably, they move to somewhere where they can get a job. And what we've got here at the moment in the United Kingdom is a huge influx of young people. Now, those young people are here. I don't think anybody's really got a problem with that, except that if you then look at it in terms of the eligibility to get a job, the number of jobs that are on offer, whether our educational system still matches what some of these individuals have got, and some of them are very well qualified, they've got degrees and such, we are disadvantaging a huge number of young people in the United Kingdom. Now, the government has made strides in terms of trying to deal with this, but we're still talking in the region of 640,000 young people who are either unemployed, they're not in any form of training, and they're not in education either. And the fact that that figure is so stubbornly high, and it has been now for at least a decade, is because of the exploitation of unemployed European young people. The second point I wouldn't mind making, if you'll bear with me, and then I will promise I'll hand over again to Robert. I have a real issue with the Erasmus programme. Now, the Erasmus programme is effectively an EU-funded programme into our higher education. I'm going to be very dramatic with my language. For me, it's nothing more than a propaganda exercise. It really does promote EU, European Union, and European issues. Well, my comment back to that, we're in a big, big world. And I don't see why we should focus and have, funded by the European Union, programmes in our sixth form colleges, programmes in our universities, that only promote the European Union as an aspect of the future. I would like to see a much, much more broader church which says, student X, whatever your name is, whatever your background, have you thought of studying in China? Have you thought of going to the United States? Have you thought about partnering by one of our universities here in somewhere like South America? But all the time we're part of the European Union, their issue is Europe, and more Europe. And that's where I think we've got a problem for our young people.
Can I just add that with open door immigration, with lots of young people coming into the country, that when I was going into schools and talking to sixth formers about budgeting, the price of accommodation, I don't think it's disputed now that the relationship between, the multiplier between the price of accommodation and wages now is unsustainable. The youngsters of today, on an average salary leaving school or university, some of them are on maybe £17,000, £18,000. When you take into account all the budgeting side, it's very hard for them to find accommodation. And so supply and demand, more people putting a demand on accommodation, it's harder for our young people, isn't it?
Thank you for that. Rowan, are you happy with those answers? Okay. Thank you very much. The next question is from H. Trevor Jones. Is he here? Thank you. I noticed you put two questions in. This is a little bit cheeky. In what way would you expect leaving the EU to further the course of peace and harmony in the world for the benefit of all humankind? Perhaps I could ask David Dean to take that question first, please.
Well, that's an interesting one. I think free trade is probably the most important thing for harmony in the world. I would rather see products crossing borders than armies. And so the more free trade that we trade with our fellow neighbours in Europe, in the rest of the world, with the Commonwealth. I think that will create peace and harmony in the world. And I also believe that education is an important factor. And I also think that with the onset of online, Wi-Fi and all those aspects, we're going to see a colossal explosion in information, as we've already seen. And I think that will create a certain amount of harmony in itself, and hopefully eventually with a globalised world, although it's got some dangers, I just feel that it can also bring harmony as well. So that's my view on that.
Thank you. Are you happy with that answer, Trevor? Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. So I was thinking more of recent, the Middle East, particularly the Africa.
Yes.
Yeah, we could trade with Syria. It'd be better than dropping bombs on Syria, but I don't know how we get there.
Well, exactly. Did you know the European Union spent £1 billion on the infrastructure in Syria that various countries that we are now bombing? That we're now bombing. We move on to another question. This is from Trevor Danke. Is he here, please?
Danby, probably.
Danby, sorry. My apologies. How much credence do you give to David Cameron's assertion that leaving the Europe would mean free access for immigrants? And there's a similar question from me. There's a similar question. A similar question from Kay Pearce. Why do successive governments persist in keeping us in Europe? Perhaps I could ask Councillor David Lewis to answer that question, please.
Thank you. I have no idea why they keep us in Europe, I've got to be honest with you. We're in charge. We're having the referendum tomorrow. So what was the first question?
How much credence do you give to David Cameron's assertion?
Thank you. I think if we take over our borders, we will control access for immigrants. I find it very interesting that we are... How's that?
Excuse me, are we getting interference from the EU at the moment?
No, on the subject of immigrants, I find it quite distressing that because of open borders, we are being flooded by immigrants, and we cannot deal with immigrants from outside Europe. There are people in this world who probably have a genuine need and want to come here. We simply can't deal with them because of the European legislation. It means we just have to take whatever comes over the border. Wishing to sort of quote racism, as I'm sure most people have been accused of, if wishing to quote racism, I think it is a far more racist attitude that denies us the opportunity to give succor and salvation to people who might desperately need it. We are unable to do so.
I don't give David Cameron's statement any credence at all. I think his credibility on this subject is... A fundamental obligation of a government is to make the population secure. You can only have a secure population if you have a secure border to your country. And we don't have that at the moment because we cannot control our borders. Now, we're not part of the Schengen Agreement, we have an opt-out on that. But anybody gaining a European Union passport, which is what every single person I would assume in this audience has got, once you have that plum-coloured document, you can come into this country. And we can't stop anybody. And no amount of assertion that Europol can suddenly start looking at people and identifying a criminal record and signalling in advance that they might not come in. Quite frankly, absolute nonsense, absolute nonsense. So I would go back to, if David Cameron's assertion was even faintly credible, which I've already said it's not, and if anybody puts that question to you, ask them, what's the difference between the plum-coloured passport you have at the moment, shared by, figures vary, 450, 500 million people, and a document that I had only for a few years, which if I remember was very dark blue, possibly black, and that told me where I could go and also told the rest of the world the country that I belonged to. And those were two very clear messages, and that's where David Cameron fails, and he fails miserably.
Trevor, are you happy with those answers? Oh, that's what we like to hear. Am I the only one who's rather surprised that we know the date of the general election in 4 years' time, but we don't know the date of the referendum, which may be 4 months' time? Am I the only one who's a bit suspicious about that? Anyway, we have 3 similar questions here. Mike Ward, is he here? Thank you. Please explain your proposed alternative to the EU. And Colin Dawson asks, why are we still in the EU? And someone who's just called Taylor says, why do the other 27 nations want to stay? Perhaps. Anyway, Mike Ward's question, please explain your proposed alternative to the EU. Perhaps I could ask Diane to comment.
If I told you, I'd have to shoot you, I think would be my first response. Quite seriously, I'm not going to even begin to give you an answer, except that I would say it's a lot rosier and a lot more positive than if we stay in. And shall I tell you why I'm going to give you that answer? Because I'm not trying to duck your question, I wish I could. But I'm going to respond by explaining. What we have so far is the result of 2 years' worth of competencies review, months of shuttle diplomacy between David Cameron and the member states, and all we've got to show for it is 4 sentences with no detail whatsoever. We're also in a position where until the 17th/18th of February, we don't know how the other 27 member states are going to react. And thirdly, we have a civil service that has not been told to prepare for Brexit. Now, I'm not able to tell the civil service what to do. I certainly can't tell David Cameron what to do, and I can't say or even begin to instruct what 27 member states should do. But what I can tell you is that in terms of what I think would happen, I'll go back to some of the points that were made tonight, and they were straightforward facts. There is the issue of money that doesn't leave these shores, direct money to fund the European Union coffers. There's the second tranche of money, which has a positive economic impact, which we don't give as part of our benefit system to people's families who are still based in their home country. We also, if we are able to control our borders, we can start to plan accordingly in terms of the infrastructure that we need. Infrastructure, and I'm meaning how much housing and where, the number of school places and where, the amount of hospitals that we need and staff that we need. And we can start doing planning like a proper civil society and a sovereign government actually ought to be doing. So please, sir, I know I can't answer your question probably as definitively as you would want. But what I've tried to do is give you some explanations as to what I think would be the positives and the positives that will come out of those that are on the Leave side. My husband's very good at home. Every single night I'm greeted with, what was the tough question tonight? You've just got it. But I will ask everybody here, bear in mind that question I gave you. Can we live outside of the European Union? Do we need the political control in every aspect of our life that membership means? The answer is no, and therefore in terms of what we're looking at is the freedom that this country will have to do what it wants, when it wants, how it wants, and for the benefit of the people that live here.
I'd like to just make some random sort of observations relating to those questions. You mentioned, who was it that asked the question in the first place? Mike Ward. Where's Mike? Mike, you said, why do the other 27 other countries want to stay in? Your issue. That was the question I was... well, 26 out of those 28 countries benefit hugely financially. Okay? The net contributors are...
Can I qualify my question?
Sorry?
Can I qualify my question?
Oh, okay, because I was going to say... Yeah,
Could you
okay.
shout out? Sorry? Could you shout out, please? Yeah. Don't it appear odd to the panel that you want us to leave, whereas the other 27 nations want to stay together? It's very odd, isn't it? Really only want to be. And also, the reason they want to stay together is that 27 nations, with their economic power, as an economic bloc and economies of scale, will be able to compete with the other economic blocs, like the United States, China, and upcoming India. And we will, if we leave, we will sink into and gradually
Okay, sorry, can we please listen to the man?
Can't hear it. Give him a mic.
Okay.
You're lucky.
Okay, thank you. The questioner asked, isn't it odd that we're the only country that wants to leave, the other 27 do, and it is concerned about whether Britain would sink into the abyss without the other countries. I think Caroline...
Okay, well, as I say, 26 countries benefit hugely financially in the short term, shall we say, but Greece is paying the price, yeah? That could easily happen to most of the European countries. Is that what you want to happen to France? Italy is on the brink. Something came in this year, it's called the bail-in system. Remember, I have a financial background. The bail-in system means, I don't know if any of you are aware, but 4 Italian banks went bust last year. Now they can come after the account holders for the money. There was quite a famous, well, it was reported in the media in Italy, a guy committed suicide because the bank took money out of his account to keep them solvent. That's going to affect now 11 European countries. Think back. Some of us maybe have short memories about Cyprus. I've got friends who live in Cyprus. They lost 40% of their savings overnight. Is that what you want to happen? And why did we, all of you who've got money in the banks and building societies, remember at the beginning of this year when it was reduced, that compensation amount from 85,000 being protected to 75,000. That's the EU again. I spoke, the Bruges group had invited the Alternative for Deutschland MEP over in the middle of last summer. And I said to him that the British people were going to leave. He looked totally shocked. This is guy from Germany. He said that you can't leave. And I said, why not? He said, because we need your money. And we'll have to look after the Italians and French without you. Seriously, that was his response. I've got a witness in a pink shirt who stood up.
It's on video, because you should never believe a man in a pink shirt.
Chairman, talking about follow-up for
I'll come to you. Let Diane speak first. Let Diane speak first, then I'll come back to you, sir. Thank you.
Can I endorse what Caroline's just said? I, over the last few months, have been going to the EU Constitution Committee. And I've gone on 2 occasions, and the reason I've gone is because what's called the Sherpas, these are the 4 individuals who have been handling the feedback, if you like, for UK Brexit back into the Constitution Committee. And the first one that I went along to, the 4 all gave their input, they gave their comments, and their comments distilled down to the following. And again, this is on record, you can look at it and Google it and you'll be able to find it on the European Parliament website. Quote, "We cannot afford for the United Kingdom to go. The deficit that the UK withdrawal in terms of financial contribution would destabilise the European Union to such an extent we cannot afford to let them go." Second point, if the United Kingdom goes, who is next? And who is next? They then ran through the list. And it ran along the lines of Greece, Portugal, Spain, and we can make your own minds up. But the 4, the strongest countries, not a problem. The weaker ones, where there is also a big push for leaving the European Union, they would be next. And the final message that came up was, we've got to keep the United Kingdom in at all costs. Now just bear in mind what I've said. If that's what they were saying, a very powerful message, why is what David Cameron has negotiated so paltry in terms of issues?
I did promise the gentleman at the back a chance to make a quick comment. Is it possible to speak up a bit?
What we've heard tonight is your own version of Project Fear. You might call it Project Panic. We've heard, for example, that we're not able to trade with the rest of the world if we're in the EU. With the people who've made that point, please explain why Germany, for example, is able to sell 3 times as much as we manage to sell to China. Why it is able to sell more to India than we do. Our problem is that we don't manufacture enough things that the world wants to buy. It's not that the European Union prevents us trading.
Can we have a question, please, and not a speech?
Well, I would like to ask the same question that has already been asked. It's really not good enough for Diane James to duck the question about what the alternative is if, as you expect, Brexit occurs. Are we going to be the same as Norway? If we're going to be the same as Norway, then we have to accept freedom of movement of people and labour. If we're the same as Norway, we have to contribute to the EU budget. And Norway is the 10th largest contributor to the EU budget. You can't duck these questions.
You've made your point.
None of the answers.
I'm going to ask Diane James to reply, please.
So I didn't deliberately duck the question. I gave the answer to the best of my knowledge and to the best of the detail that I can give you, given that the election campaign and purdah period has not yet started, and we haven't got the detail from David Cameron. The point that you made, sir, which I think is a very valid one, is effectively this Project Fear. Now, I don't think we're playing Project Fear here. I tell you who's playing Project Fear. David Cameron started off with, quote, he was going to achieve a reformed Europe. Well, he didn't do very well on that, did he? Because he's achieved absolutely nothing. Then he said he was going to go for a reformed relationship with Europe. Well, he hasn't achieved that either. So the contention that staying in, everything's going to be rosy, I think that falls by the wayside. What I think you have heard, and I would hope the majority of the audience agree, is a lot of fact, a lot of data supporting what the cost of our membership is, that could go, what the costs to us in terms of civil society are and would be lost or would be changed to the benefit of the United Kingdom, and the obligations that we would have to the European Union that we wouldn't have to continue. Now, I will give you one straight example. The European Union still has not finalised a trade deal with China as a European Union deal. And this is years in the making, years in the making. Germany, being the strongest European country, just decides to go and do its own thing. And I've heard people say you can fly to Beijing 11 times a day from Frankfurt Airport. Now, I don't know if that's absolutely true or not. But the point is, Germany is part of the European Union and does its own thing. In comparison, the United Kingdom signs up to everything that the European Union dictates and just says, oh, right, okay, we better wait until a trade deal is done with China. Our view, my view, the parties that I represent, and I think the group that I represent, is one of saying we don't and shouldn't have to wait for the European Union to get its act together. Let's be out of that and let's do our own thing. And my last point, we have never ever said Norway and Switzerland would be the models that we would follow. What we have said is that they are two examples where some of what they do could be used to the UK's advantage. They are never models we've said we would follow.
I'm going to move on to another question. This comes from Jenny Burrington. Is she here? Oh, right, thank you. If we come out of the European Common Market, will we be able to scrap some of the stupid laws imposed upon us by Europe? Bob Heath asks, will leaving the EU enable us to abandon the EU's ridiculous environmental policy? Jeffrey Patterson says, can we still have agreements with Europeans for free trade? And John, I think it's John Moore, says, what is the overall saving if we leave? So 4 questions on similar questions about whether we can break free of some of the EU laws. Can I perhaps ask David to take that one?
Thank you. Well, £530 million a week for starters is what we're going to say. Environmental laws, well, any laws really, it's going to take a while to unpick. We can't just simply wipe them off the day after the referendum. What we will probably have to do is adopt them and change them to suit our circumstances. Apart from that, I think that's pretty much it.
I think it is worth just reminding ourselves what Brexit could mean and could happen. Let's try and be really, really positive about this. So on June the 23rd, we get our referendum. The polling booths close at 10 p.m. that night, and the following morning we all wake up, the count's gone on, and David Cameron will probably come on TV, I hope he'll come on TV, to say that the United Kingdom has voted to leave. Assuming he does that, he then invokes Article 50. So he goes back to the European Commission, he goes back to Mr. Juncker and Mr. Schulz, and he tells them formally the decision the United Kingdom has taken. There is then, it's written into the treaty laws and the treaty detail, we have 2 years to negotiate our exit. There is also the period of leeway, a reasonable period of leeway they call it, and some people view that as being another 6 months. So that's 2.5 years when the parties sit down. When I say the parties, that's the EU and the UK government, and we come to agreement on a beneficial parting of the ways, a beneficial trade relationship, a beneficial partnering with where we want it to be.
Is it not a fact that it will be the other 27 that will actually decide?
Thank you. Jenny, are you happy with that answer?
Article 50 doesn't mention trade. The trade negotiations could go on for 10 years.
I think we shall move on to another question. There are different points of view. Can I quote comments attributed to Voltaire that says, I do not agree with what you say, sir, but I'd fight for your right to say it. That is the principle I have. I have no problem with the fact. Sorry, sir, you have spoken, please. I can't let all 300 people in this room make a speech. I have a question, but I thank you for coming. I have a question here from Terry Moody, the organiser of this event. He says here, a friend at my chess club, I think this is just, he wants to advertise the fact that he's got a friend, I think. A friend at my chess club wants to stay in the EU. Can you suggest 3 good reasons I can give him which are the most convincing arguments for coming out? Nick O'Gorman asks a similar question. What are your top 3 benefits for leaving? And Jay O'Toole asks, what benefits can we hope for if we leave? Caroline, would you like to take that one first?
Okay, well, for a start, I don't want to lose the NHS, and I think 99% of the people in this room will feel that way. With TTIP, with CETA, you will be paying for the NHS, okay? Secondly, human rights. It's strange, isn't it, that the European Parliament talks about human rights, but they have a blatant disregard for the human rights when it comes to the European Arrest Warrant, which contravenes the Human Rights Act 1948. It contravenes Section 38 of the Magna Carta. We're not supposed to be incarcerated without any evidence. That contravenes our human rights. The European Arrest Warrant allows us to be taken from these shores to another European country to languish in prison for 6 months or more without any visitation rights. And should you become acquitted, there's no compensation. You've probably lost your job. You could have lost your family. Think about the high-profile cases. We've seen what happened with the Asher King case, and that was a warrant issued by our own country. People shouldn't just be thrown into prison without any evidence. There was an English judge in 2012, a guy called Colin Dines, and he was arrested and taken back to Italy. And his words were, well, we were woken up at 5 in the morning. We were taken from these shores. We had no note of what the case was to offer, to answer to. So we couldn't produce any evidence at all. And that guy suffered a stroke. So if that's the sort of regime you want to live under. Thirdly, European army. No one's talked about this. Everybody seems to be just concerned about pounds, shillings and pence, GDP. The GDP doesn't affect people in the street. It gives extra money to the people at the top because most people haven't seen an increase in their salary for a few years now. The European army is already in evidence. We've got 6 European countries that form the European army at the minute. You speak to the Greeks who have been subjected to an army on their borders. That constitutes occupation, but they're not strong enough to fight back. Frontex, they're on the Greek borders. They're in Greece. That's a fact. Thank you.
Are you happy with that answer? Let's move on to another question. This question is actually addressed specifically to Diane. For Diane James, what did you hope to achieve when you decided to stand for the European Parliament, and have you achieved it? That's from Janet Baker. That's from Janet Baker. Is she here? Okay.
I stood to be a member of the European Parliament purely with the objective of achieving, first of all, a voice in the European Parliament that would stand up for the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom's interests, and ultimately to achieve Brexit. And I think I've achieved the first, because I do make a contribution in terms of speeches and debates and asking awkward questions. And if this year, or certainly by the end of 2017, I and my colleagues and such, and people like Caroline and the groups, if we achieve a referendum, I will achieve my second goal, and they're the two.
Janet, are you happy with that answer? Okay. Sorry, the questions, we're not taking questions from the floor. I have been a little bit indulgent, I know. A question here just from someone called Phil. If we stay in and eventually adopt the union, what will that mean for the UK economy? Anyone like to take that question?
I'm going to go back to a point I made in my speech, if you don't mind, which is we're not talking about the status quo, and we do have 5 additional countries on the road to becoming European Union members. Every single one of those 5 will be looking to the likes of the United Kingdom, France and Germany to support them economically. So what we will see is an increase in the contributions we made, if you like, the bill that the United Kingdom is given annually to be part of the European Union. Coming down the line, and the press has picked up a little on this, is what is coming through because of the pressures of migration. And Mr. Juncker decided, for instance, I'm not entirely sure where he came up with one of his figures, but he's decided he needs an extra €3 billion to deal with the problems caused by the migration levels that we've got. And it was the German finance minister who recently suggested, and it is being considered, to put 5 cents, that virtually equates to 5 pence, on a litre of fuel. So there's 2 instances in terms of cost and ultimately impact it will have on the UK economy. 5p on fuel at the moment when we've got a very, very low inflation rate is no bad thing, and equally on the basis that the price of oil is very, very low. But just imagine if the situation changes, 5 pence on fuel, and it will just be an initial 5 pence, and then it might be 10 pence or whatever else they want to raise. That is the sort of issue. These people in Brussels and Strasbourg, they forget it's your money. It's your money. It's you as taxpayers. You pay the European Union bill, and you subsidise the other countries, the poorer countries, for whom European Union membership is a real benefit, but for which the UK, for the United Kingdom, it's just an absolute cost. It's as simple as that.
Can I point out it's now 11 minutes past 9 and I intend to finish about at 9:30, so we have about 19 minutes left. Is Phil here?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you happy with that answer?
Well, it wasn't the union, it's the euro. If we adopted
Right.
the euro, it would
I actually wrote. Okay. I actually wrote a book about the euro, which was published just before the euro came in. My comment's very simple. You can only have a single currency if you have a single economy, and you can only have a single economy if you have a single government. Is that what you want? A question here from Tony Russell. Is Tony Russell here? Thank you. If we come out, what security problems does this pose? And there is a similar question from Mrs. Monica Simpson. If we leave the EU, will the immigrant settlement now in France, in Calais, be in our country due to change in the border control changes? And a lady called Pam has just submitted a question. What about security if we leave the EU? Who would like to take that question?
I think I pretty much covered that one in my speech, but I think these questions were put before that. There is a separate agreement between us and France. We have our border control on the other side of the tunnel, and the French have their border control on our side of the tunnel. If the controls were to go, there would be a massive influx of people across the continent to come here. The tunnel's quite small in relative size, as are the ferries are not that frequent. The effect on France would be enormous. The camp would grow beyond comprehension, to be quite frank. So it's absolutely no interest of France whatsoever to break that current agreement.
Okay. Tony, are you happy with the answer?
No.
Could you shout, please?
Yes, Cameron will make his point you're on 20 soil at the moment. It's not even getting
So I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Give it one more. We've got people who can go to France and stop, migrants getting onto lorries, for example, right? So typically,
Yeah.
we won't have guys that come out of Europe, will we?
Yes, the agreement with Calais is a separate, it's nothing to do with the European Union. That's a private agreement between Britain and France. I think that point's been made a couple of times. Remember, all the people in Calais, they're French citizens, so they're not British citizens. All. Well, that's up to France whether they're French citizens or not. We have some questions here about the actual mechanics of leaving the European Union. How will we actually leave the EU? Won't they just say, okay, we'll renegotiate, or will they just try to stop us? And Daniel Evans asked that question, and Ross Henning has asked, would it really take us 2 years to leave under the European laws? Do you know the answer?
I think I've covered invoking Article 50. I hope that's satisfied. That is the legally recognised mechanism that can be used to activate our exit. I think it will take 2 years. It will be a complex series of negotiations, and so it should be. I think the disappointing aspect at the moment is that seemingly David Cameron is not planning for Brexit until now, and it's purely, it seems, as a result of polls swinging in favour of leaving, that it really is forcing his attention to address that. But one thing is absolutely sure, having attended the Constitution Committee and equally feedback from some of the others, the EU is ahead of this. They are already planning for a United Kingdom exit from the European Union. So the worst case scenario is that there is a vote to leave, but David Cameron doesn't sufficiently plan in whether it's weeks or months or maybe a year, and there has to be a catch-up period by which time, quite frankly, the European Union will have the upper hand. But I hope that David Cameron and the civil servants will come to their senses and start investing in a proper plan.
I'm sure the
Thank you very much.
will be
Okay.
planning
David?
like they do for
As I was saying, that if you do download this, there is quite a comprehensive section on Article 50 on how you will actually disentangle ourselves from the
What's it called?
It's called Change and Go, and it is on the website.
We have a question here from, a factual question from Elaine Kingston. She just asked, are expats allowed to vote in this referendum? I believe they are. I think it's the short answer to that one. We're doing very well, folks, so let's keep going. I know you're all excited and want to get back and watch Question Time tonight. Or football or something else. A question here from, I believe is it Matt Watts? Okay. Have I got your name correct, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Will we lose the benefits already afforded to us by the EU, such as employers' rights, holiday, paternity leave, and so on? And Mr. H. Trevor Jones, who rather cheekily asked two questions, asked, would leaving the EU make it easier for visiting or travelling around the continent by train across borders? Should we be like the Swiss and join Schengen to facilitate this? So a question about whether we would actually keep any benefits. I don't know who would like... Caroline, that sounds like a question you would answer.
Sorry, I can't think of any benefits for being a member of the European Union, so I'm struggling with this question. So people say to me, well, if we've got a holiday home in France, and if we use the NHS, will all that go? Well, I was talking to a lady a few months ago, and she lived in France for 22 years and paid tax in France. And her husband was seriously ill, and he had to spend time in a French hospital. And he died over in France, and she's now moved back into the UK. She said what a lot of people don't realise is that the French government took £29,000 from her husband's estate to pay for that supposed free medical treatment. So, just saying that it's not what you think it is, being part of the European Union. Also, we talk about, I'm sorry, I'm digressing, because also we talk about trade, but nobody's actually talked about procurement. Does anybody work for a big corporation or council that has to go through procurement procedures? A lot of trade, for example, I know in Stroud that there's an incinerator plant, and there's lots of companies, local companies, that would love to have the work, but the work has been awarded to a Spanish company because of the EU regulations. So much for being part of this fantastic club where we give our work away. Look at the Bombardier case the other week.
How many British companies get contracts abroad?
Shut up.
Could we please try to be polite? Yes. I think I would, I think, Matt, I think what I would say is, I think all of us want to be on very good terms with our European friends and neighbours. I want to be on very good terms with my friends and neighbours, but I don't actually want to live in a commune with my neighbours. I still want to have a fence around my garden and walls there. I get on very well with my neighbours. The alternative to that isn't that I build a 20-foot high fence with machine gun turrets on it. You know, we can be, you know, I can live with my neighbours in my own fenced property where I have my borders and still live very happily with my neighbours. And I think that's certainly what all the panel would like us to see with everyone else. I'm glad that there are at least 10 of you that agree with me. We just have 2 more questions left.
The rail travel question.
Sorry?
You missed the rail travel question.
Oh, the rail travel question, yes. Who wants to answer that? Should we join the Schengen Agreement? Will leaving the EU make it easier for us to visit, travelling around the continent on train across borders? Who knows the answer to that?
The fundamental tenet, or one of them, of the European Union concept, as has been mentioned, is the free movement of people, services and goods. Well, interestingly, it's already starting to break down, and there are issues about border control. I'm sure you've read about this in the press. And just to give you an anecdote, Strasbourg straddles the French-German border. And when all of the MEPs, all 751 of them, and everything that goes with them, monthly has to go to Strasbourg, of course the local economy benefits. But we've had the bizarre situation that those MEPs staying in the German side of Strasbourg have to go through the border control now, which France has put in place as part of their emergency reaction to the bombing in Paris. But has it caused a massive problem? Well, it did for about the first trip, on the basis that the passports were being asked to, shown and checked and such. But it didn't cause the major issues that everybody who says, just because we're going to lose the freedom of movement aspect, will cause. My argument still, in terms of rail travel and rail-related aspects, we would not be building HS2, but for a European Union directive on fast rail services. That's not to say we don't need improved rail infrastructure in the United Kingdom, but I would actually rather see, and I know my transport spokesman colleague would rather see money invested in rail services, improving the sort of thing that you and I try and use, getting us to Waterloo or Victoria on a daily basis, rather than a very, very expensive white elephant that bypasses George Osborne's constituency in aspects like that. I think do be positive. The European Union is not all bad. We're not trying to present it as Mr. Nasty, Mr. Devil, Mr. Dark. I go back to the point. A lot of what has happened has been beneficial. Clean Water Directive would be a classic. But what we're saying is the political control that now comes with membership is not what the United Kingdom needs or should have in terms of its security and safety and civil society in the future.
I congratulate Mr. Trevor Jones on managing to get 2 questions in.
Thank you.
I've just been asked to read out again the winners of the raffle. Green 200, yellow 347, yellow 329, white 579, white 590, green 233, yellow 335, green 206 and green 258. We just have 2 more quick questions before we finish. Richard Tier asked, we're told by the in crowd, U-turned, that we receive £3,000 per person from the EU. How much do we have to pay out per person? Does anyone know the figure? I know it's more than we. I think it's about 80% more than. I think the amount we pay out is something like 80% more than we get back in. Something like that. Okay. Sorry, we don't know. At least we're being honest. The final question from there are 2 people who asked similar questions. Glenys Bevan, is she here? Thank you. Asks, the Remainers always bang on about the Leavers have no plans for the way our country will be governed should we leave the EU. How do we counter this? And a different but not a completely unrelated question from someone who just called Mr. C, who says...
Who is he? Who is Mr. C?
Does Mr.
Won't ask the question.
Does Mr. C wish to identify himself? Okay. Well, you don't have to. It's a free country. Still, how do you reply to people that accuse us of being xenophobic? Anyway, so the question is from Glenys Bevan about how do we countermand questions about the Leavers say that we have no plans if we leave the EU. Who'd like to have a go at that? David Dean, we haven't heard from you for a while. Do you want to have a go?
I think we face an excellent future, a very positive future, because I think there's 50 million a day being wasted. Okay, there are projects that are good, etc. A lot of goods come out of some of these harmonisation schemes, but we have embassies and high commissioners around the world. I think they could be obsolete if we stayed in, but in terms of trade, I've got experience, particularly in Africa and in Europe, with the UKTI, and they're if you like, the Board of Trade for exports, and they provide an excellent service, and there's an infrastructure of people. So I can see a situation where many jobs will be created as we go around the world organising bilateral trade deals. And I think that's a terrific opportunity for the young. I can also see that, and I've heard some sceptics say to me that it's not that easy, it's a very competitive world, etc., for us to do trade with a lot of countries around the world. It's very competitive and so on and so forth. But if you're doing a bilateral trade deal with a country, you say, we'll buy your product, you buy ours, and they're only too grateful. If they did it in isolation, I mean, particularly some of the countries I've had experience with, they have the same difficulty selling their products just on a one-directional basis. But if it's bilateral trade, then you sit around the table and you negotiate what you've got to sell, and if there are products that we are unable to necessarily produce ourselves, then it's only right we import them. And we then focus on the products that we're good at, and we specialise in those. And therefore, rather than being in a large, huge block in the EU, there's a massive world out there. And I just feel that we should be tapping into that. And there's also another argument which says if all your eggs are in one basket and it all goes wrong, you've got a massive problem. Now, it's hard work doing single deals with single countries and so on, but I tell you, at the end of the day, if you lose one of those deals, you haven't lost a lot. probably it could be quite a big volume business, but by and large, you've lost one deal. But if all your eggs are in one basket and it all goes pear-shaped, believe me, you've got a big problem. And therefore, I think there's a wonderful future. We've just got to get over this problem that we set ourselves back in 1973 when we signed in to what we thought was a common market, and it just isn't what we thought it was going to be.
I'll just make a quick comment there. There are 198 countries in the world, 28 in the European Union, and 170 that are not. World trade is governed by the World Trade Organization. We are not allowed to take our seat in that organisation because we're members of the European Union. We are the 6th largest economy in the world. I think we are now going to have to close down at 11:30. Can I thank, first of all, Terry Moody and all the team for organising tonight. Can I thank the panel? I would like to thank you all for coming along tonight, including those people who clearly want us to stay in the European Union. We value your bravery in coming along here tonight, and we thank you for that. Can I just point out, by the way, that this meeting was open to the public, to everybody, regardless of their affiliation. There was no filtering, there was no censoring, there was no selecting, and we have answered every single question that has been filed.
Thanks to a good chairman, even if I don't always agree.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. In view of that, I'll let you answer the 2 questions. Thank you all very much. Have a safe journey home. Good night.